All right. This is our first topic on the AWS, on the network on AWS cloud. So today's topic is going to be Amazon Virtual Private Cloud, popularly known as Amazon VPC. When we talk about Amazon VPC, there are multiple components that comes with Amazon VPC. Amazon VPC is the networking on AWS. Remember when the networking section that we have earlier, if you have all your devices connected together on your on-prem data center, you can still have the same connection.
Daniel, I don't need you over here.
Please, if you are not talking to the class, can you mute yourself?
Sorry. This way.
All right, sorry about that. So let's look at the networking services on AWS. So the major networking services on AWS is VPC, AWS VPC. So with AWS VPC, this comes with some other sub-components that makes it possible for you to set up a networking on AWS. And the first component that comes under AWS VPC is VPC subnet, or some people just normally call it AWS subnet, or just simple subnet. Then after the AWS subnet, we have the internet gateway. And we are going to be talking about all of these services one by one in more detail. Then the next service or resources that you're going to be talking about is route table. Remember, route table is where the instruction for the router is located. Any router, they use route table to get their instruction. They use route table to know where to send traffic to. Then the route is what you see inside the route table. That is the instruction that is put inside the route table for a router to use. So when a network wants to send traffic to another network, it sends it to the route table. It sends it to the router. Then the router go to the route table to check the route where the traffic should be sent to. And when you have a private network, by default, it cannot communicate outside to any other network. If you want it to be able to communicate to other network, then you need to permit it to be able to communicate outside of that network. And for this to happen, you need some services or resources. And one of them is this one here, Internet Gateway. And the second one is NAT Gateway. We are going to explain the difference between the two later in the class. Then, remember, no company, or hardly you will see any company that use either AWS only or GCP only or Azure only. Companies tend to use multiple cloud provider together with their own on-prem. And this means, or this model of using multiple data center or cloud provider together with on-prem is what is referred to as hybrid model. So the hybrid model when you want to connect your VPC or your AWS cloud so that it can communicate to your on-prem resources, then you need to be able to connect both of them together. The first, or the basic, or the default means for your cloud to be able to communicate or use to communicate to your on-prem is through the general internet. But general internet is not secure. So there are multiple means or other means that you can use to connect your on-prem devices together with the devices that you have in the cloud. So one of the most secure means is through the direct connect. Then we have another one called VPN, which is Virtual Private Network. The direct connect is the best option because it uses AWS private network. Why the VPN is like the general internet, but it's more secure than using the general internet because it's encrypted, it uses IP tunnel. So we're going to explain both of them later in the class so you understand which is the best. And if you are asked in an interview, these are the two options that you should give them. Never go through the general internet because the general internet is not secure. All right. I believe everybody remember this diagram. So initially it was, we have used this diagram for our own, TheCornelis data center networking. But now this is exactly how AWS computer data centers look like. They have all these physical devices in their data center. All these physical devices in their data center, just as we have it in our own data center too. But now that we want to be using AWS data center, which is called a compute or cloud computing, then AWS will have to provide access for us for all of these resources so that we can use these resources. So because we don't know what AWS have, and we can't be telling them, hey, this is what I want you guys to use. What AWS just provide us is that they provide us what is called an icons, different icons to specify what a particular service is. So you will need to be familiar with some of these icons if you are doing solution architect, because if you want to architect your solution, if you want to draw the diagram, how your resources are connected together, just like what we have here, then you're going to be using the icon. You are not going to be using all these resources or all this physical server. You're going to be using this icon. So you will need to be familiar with this icon. This icon, what you see, what does it mean? Right. So for example, now if you want to say something like a server, if you look at here, we have servers here, we have different servers. But if you are drawing the architecture in AWS, like you are not using the physical server, this is what we are using here, this one here. So AWS, when they see this, or anybody that you send the architectural diagram to, when they see this, they know that you are talking about diagram, you are talking about server. But this is not something that you should cram. It will come to you naturally by the time you start working in the cloud. It will come to you naturally. Then we have AWS provide all of these services for us. So every service that AWS provide, they will use an icon to denote it that this is what this service means. So, and these services that AWS have is not only you that is AWS customer. AWS have a lot of customers and all of them they scatter over the internet. They scatter over the internet. And you might have a legitimate means or good reason to use AWS cloud. Maybe you want to save costs. But guess what? We have other people too, like the hackers that also have their own means of just want to use AWS cloud to compromise other innocent users. So AWS have the responsibility, and you also have the responsibility to make sure that this bad person does not compromise your resources. So it's now your responsibility and AWS responsibility to make sure that this person does not compromise your resources. AWS cannot technically kick this person out because their service is generally available for anybody to use. It might come in just like as a legitimate user. It might come in like pretending to be a legitimate user, and there's no way for AWS to know. So it's now left for you to make sure that this person does not compromise your resources that you have in AWS. So AWS also help you to make sure that is not possible. And one means that AWS use to make sure that this person is not able to compromise our resources, and not necessarily this person, even other users that don't know what they are doing. If they do something bad accidentally, that might also affect you. So in order for this not to happen, AWS give you the means to separate the resources that you want to use away from other users with the help of what we call VPC. So when you want to create a resources on VPC, you have to, on AWS, you have to define your own VPC. And that VPC is just like you saying, hey, this is going to be my own space. I don't want anybody inside this space. So any resources that you are creating, you will be creating it inside this space. And this space, you have to define it using what we call an IP address CIDR block, or just a CIDR block. So the way the IP address is, or the CIDR block is, you have to say something like 10.0.0.0/16, which means that you are telling AWS that, hey, any IP address that falls within this range belongs to me. Any IP address that falls within this range belongs to me. So now, any resources that you are creating, you must make sure that that resource's IP address falls within this range. The CIDR block is a little complex topic to cover, but I will try to create a YouTube video on it. I have videos on it in my regular website. If you can look at that, I can't say specifically which under which topic, but if you want to find it, just find it under networking in our last cloud practitioner class. But I will still try to create a video for this topic on CIDR block. So you have to specify the CIDR block that you want to use, and every resources you create in that space, you must use an IP address that fall within that CIDR block. So now, anytime you want to use your resources, you have to connect to your own space. But that does not mean that every resources you want to use on AWS must be inside your space, which is called inside your network, which is called a VPC. There are some resources in AWS that you cannot put inside your VPC because AWS manage these resources themselves. It is AWS resources. It's just like you have an apartment and the apartment say, hey, this is your room, or this is your own apartment or your own unit, and they give you some resources like your fridge, your stove, your dishwasher, and then you buy other resources that you need also. But there are some resources in that apartment that cannot be only assigned to your room. Like example, the fitness room. The fitness room is for everybody, so you have to go there. So the same way on AWS platform or AWS cloud, there are some resources that we call managed services. Those managed services, they are not going to be in your VPC. So if you want to use any managed service that AWS provide, if you want to use any managed services that AWS provide, you have to connect from your VPC or to that services. You have to connect from your VPC to that services. So example of that service is what is an S3 bucket, which is a storage device on AWS, which we are going to discuss later. So our VPC now, so what is VPC? So a VPC, Amazon VPC to be precise, is just you provisioning, or it's like you provisioning an isolated section of the AWS cloud where you're going to be deploying your resources. And you can launch resources in the isolated section or the virtual network you define. Within a VPC, you can organize your resources into smaller network called subnets. This, what you are seeing here, from here to here, is a network that, okay, let's even start. This here, from here to here, is this is AWS network, which is a bigger network. Then from this bigger network, you create your own smaller network. From this bigger network, you create your own, you define your own network. Sorry about my drawing. You create your own network, which is a giant network too. Like, there are some giant that is bigger than giant than another giant. You know what I mean? So this is like your big network. So this big network, guess what you can also do? You can also create it as, divide it into a smaller network inside the big network. So we have the biggest network, the big network, and you have all those small network. So this small network that you create here is what is referred to as subnet, which is just mean sub network.